sometimes the most persistent flight response is not running from others. It's running from ourselves. It's running from our own internal sensations, like our racing heart or the rising emotion that has been wired as dangerous, to be interpreted as dangerous. And so we learn to escape through the busyness, the productivity, the workouts, the hustle. This is when we have interoceptive accuracy issues, right? And that can start to drive this chronic overdoing that masks as discipline, and it actually keeps us from emotional processing.
I really learned this firsthand about 8 months ago when I was working with a somatic therapist. When we would talk about something and it'd be like, okay, let's process it. I just wanted to move into it super quick, to bounce, to shake, to stomp, and just like go at it super fast at high speed. And she was like, no, let's slow down. Like, she was seriously like, whoa, slow down there. Like, slow the movement down, slow way down. And then I could feel these surge of emotions come through. I could feel the way that my body was actually talking to me and what it was saying from internal place.
Gosh, there are so many times in my business or in my personal life, in my relationships, where I have this small moment of conflict, like with a business partner or with my actual partner, and I just want to get out of the whole thing. I want to ghost the project. I want to run out of the room. I want to disappear and like be done with the relationship entirely. And then also, because we're talking about flight today, and this is my well-worn F response, it can also really push me into taking on one more task, doing more all of the time to avoid sitting with the discomfort of those feelings. And that brings us into today's episode, where we're looking at the flight response as part of our 4F series. And we're not just looking at what is the flight response, but also how it's connected to the emotion of fear, the emotion that we're often taught to suppress, override, or maybe pathologize instead of actually feeling.
I'm someone who's always had multiple jobs, never sitting still, overcommitting, overtraining, overworking, and honestly being rewarded for it, for how hard I worked. And I thought that's who I was, the good worker, the good girl doing all of the things. And I was almost never home. I was putting performance over rest and being busy all the time. But also, and this one is a big one for me, I have found it in my healing practices and in the slowing down. And that's directly related to fear, the fear of slowing down. And so flight is my nervous system keeping me safe by staying in motion. So today we'll explore this flight response. We'll re-examine the flight response, not just as avoidance or as a weakness, but as a misunderstood survival strategy rooted in unprocessed fear. Welcome to Trauma Rewired, the podcast that teaches you about your nervous system, how trauma lives in the body, and what you can do to heal. I'm your co-host, Jennifer Wallace. I'm a neurosomatic psychedelic preparation and integration guide, and I bring your nervous system into your peak somatic experiences. And I'm also one of the educators of the Neurosomatic Intelligence Coaching Certification.
And I'm your co-host, Elisabeth Kristof, founder of brainbase.com, an online community where we use applied neurology and somatics for nervous system health and resilience. And I'm also the founder of the Neurosomatic Intelligence Coaching Certification, an ICF-accredited course for coaches, therapists, practitioners who want framework and tools to bring the nervous system into all of the good work that you're doing. So make sure to subscribe to this episode so that you never miss one, especially as we're diving into the Fs. Before we get too deep into the flight response, let's look a little bit at how this shows up in our patterns, right? Flight is really this constant sense of urgency, this underlying feeling all of the time, like I need to escape. And that can show up as overbooking your calendar, starting new things before you finish old ones, really avoiding emotional conversations or any kind of conflict, jumping to fix things instead of feeling them. And my personal favorite, moving between business ideas or partners rapidly, always on to the next.
This is the hustler identity that masks emotional dysregulation, disconnection from one's body, working out intensely to avoid feeling, always needing to be moving, delegating a task, then redoing it because of urgency, driving through the healing process like you do with anything else.
I relate to so many of these,
I
and
know.
I really used to do that. Delegating one, I would delegate something to my team, and then I would not have the patience to wait for it to be done, and then I'd just do it myself once they'd already started, and it was super frustrating for people that work for me. And of course, diving into the healing that way. So as we look at the flight response, like any of the other Fs, it can be acute and adaptive. But again, when it's chronic, it's going to disconnect us from our lives and from our bodies. So sometimes it is a signal, though, that things are out of alignment and that we do need to leave. Like if I'm always feeling internally like I should flee something, maybe the issue is the thing and not just my nervous system
Mhm.
dysregulation. So I think it's important to also look at some of the ways that this response can serve us. Like it can be an indicator to leave a toxic work environment when our body knows before our mind. If we're constantly dreading meetings, flight might be that cue underneath to actually leave instead of not just push harder into that experience, or maybe to walk away from an escalating argument, right? If something is getting really intense, and we want to leave the situation to prevent further harm. And it might be that staying in the conversation means saying things that I don't want to, that I'll regret, or reactivating a trauma response, a trauma pattern in my body. So stepping away can actually give me space for regulation and to come up with a strategy for repair. It can also help us know when to exit an abusive relationship. One of the most protective uses of the flight response is this is not a relationship that's safe for me. And it's going to bypass our logic to preserve our safety when physiological manipulation or physical danger is present, and also to get out of physically dangerous situations, right? In an acute flight response, we are escaping a threat in real time, like crossing the street when somebody's walking too closely and we have that gut instinct of, I need to move.
And sometimes we need to take space before we make a big decision. If your system feels hijacked by urgency, flight might be a signal to pause, not perform. Getting out of the environment to come back to yourself can lead to more aligned choices. Avoiding overexposure, right? Especially for our neurodivergent folks. If a space is loud, bright, chaotic, or overwhelming, flight can help preserve our capacity by removing ourselves from overstimulation. That's protective, that's not avoidance. So, saying no to another commitment, right? That gut level contraction or urge to back out. It may be your nervous system protecting you from the overwhelm, the overexertion, and the burnout.
I want to talk to you if you're an entrepreneur who's done the work, read all the books, and you're still stuck in the same cycles, overdoing and then shutting down, struggling to set or hold clear boundaries, feeling blocked from the level of visibility and impact you know you're meant for, and unable to feel good doing it. I get it because I see it all the time and I've lived it. Together with Margie Feltoon, my business partner and a multi-seven-figure entrepreneur who's been through this exact cycle, I'm teaching a free workshop called The Capacity Gap. We're going to show you how these hidden nervous system patterns, not mindset or strategy, are driving burnout, stress, and self-sabotage. And we'll teach you practical neuroscience-backed tools you can use right away to change how you work, lead, and feel in your business. It's free. It's on August 28th, and there's a replay available. Register at rewirecapacity.com. We'd love to have you there. Just to kind of briefly overview what's happening in our brain and our nervous system, the flight response is like the fight response, part of our sympathetic nervous system, mobilizing energy. It's the urge to escape perceived danger, real or perceived, through movement. And this doesn't always look like physically running away. It can also look like staying constantly busy, switching roles, mentally checking out. And we've already covered the core brain structures in our F responses, but a quick reminder, our amygdala is going to detect a threat, whether that's internal or external. Our hypothalamus is going to initiate the stress response via the HPA axis. Our periaqueductal gray, our PAG, is going to trigger the pre-programmed escape behavior, the F response that it thinks is most adaptive in that situation. And then our prefrontal cortex is going to start to be under resourced, under fueled, so that we start to lose a little bit of perspective and operate from that sense of urgency rather than from clarity.
And it's important to remember that this is reflexive. It's a protective response, adaptations for survival that we developed because of the family, society, environment that we developed in. With complex trauma and structural trauma, these responses can become chronic, frequently occurring, and then often they become part of what we identify with, who we are. But they aren't our personality, they are well-worn paths in the brain and body.
So when flight becomes a chronic state, it's not about escaping actual danger anymore. It's about avoiding the sensation of the fear itself. So in our brain and our behavior, our brain is predicting danger even in safe context. And our prefrontal cortex then is going to remain under resourced. So that's going to make it hard to pause and reflect. And our emotional categories in that state, like the depth and the variety of emotions that we can feel and experience, is going to become a little bit limited. And fear can start to be masked as anxiety or urgency or irritation. And our system is going to start to seek movement or novelty or more tasks to avoid stillness, which has been encoded in our brain and our nervous system as unsafe.
And then let's talk about what's happening in the body. This chronic activation of sympathetic pathways, right? Restlessness, GI upset, high heart rate, shallow breath, physical symptoms of anxiety, dizziness, or maybe insomnia or muscle tension, right? Somatic signs of fear might be bypassed or misread as an example of like, I just need to move instead of I'm scared. I'm scared can feel like failure. It can feel like the voice of perfectionism and inner critic, and that it's not safe to be scared or to be bad at something.
When we're looking at all of our F responses, we want to think how this is related to complex post traumatic stress or CPTS. Our emotions are constructed from our interoceptive signals and our past experiences. Remember, our interoceptive signals are our internal sensations. And when stillness was historically met with danger, like punishment or rejection, or the sensations inside are too overwhelming and they lead to dissociation or more heightened stress responses, then our brain learns to interpret calm or pausing or stillness as unsafe. And it predicts that motion is what is keeping us alive. And our nervous system starts to stay in that constant state of motion and really associate that with safety. And when we were in environments with unpredictable threat or we had emotional neglect, staying busy or hypervigilant or always doing really does become a survival strategy to avoid vulnerability, to avoid feeling our own internal sensations, to avoid disappointment or abandonment, and the feelings that we have inside. And then we can experience a lot of unprocessed fear, that unprocessed stress response that gets routed into our behavior. So we maybe didn't develop with safe co regulation or emotional repair with our caregivers. So we never have the chance to complete that stress cycle when we are activated. The fear never gets discharged. And so it gets expressed as restlessness or maybe overachievement or people pleasing or perfectionism. And then when the body is in motion all of the time, and the nervous system stays dysregulated, our brain keeps constructing that sense of urgency. And that can happen in these developmental environments where emotional enmeshment or lack of boundaries were present, in a home where confrontation led to chaos, or where our unmet needs were met. Like if we expressed our unmet needs, that was met with rejection or punishment.
And I think it's important to talk about how the flight response is reinforced by structural trauma, because while chronic flight often begins in developmental environments where stillness wasn't safe or it's been misattuned, it's reinforced and amplified by the world that we live in, where systemic oppression, cultural conditions, and capitalistic values are all rewarded by being in motion and penalize rest, making it even harder to interrupt the survival pattern. Living in systems that deny safety keeps the body in perpetual mobilization. Marginalized identities can't often afford stillness. This constant output, proving worth, or staying 10 steps ahead of something becomes a conditioned response to real systemic threat. Societal messaging devalues fear and glorifies hustle. When fear is labeled as weakness and productivity is tied to worth, the flight pattern gets praised and internalized, even when it's eroding our health, relationships, and emotional presence. How this impacts emotional expression and attunement is that over time, this creates a reflexive pattern where movement replaces emotion. The nervous system defaults to action, working, scrolling, cleaning, fixing, not because it feels good, but because the body has learned that staying in this constant state of motion is safer than feeling what's underneath of the motion. So this becomes a hardwired loop of fleeing emotion through action.
And I think that really leads us to this idea that sometimes the most persistent flight response is not running from others. It's running from ourselves. It's running from our own internal sensations, like our racing heart or the rising emotion that has been wired as dangerous to be interpreted as dangerous. And so we learn to escape through the busyness, the productivity, the workouts, the hustle. This is when we have interoceptive accuracy issues, right? And that can start to drive this chronic overdoing that masks as discipline, and it actually keeps us from emotional processing.
I really learned this firsthand about 8 months ago when I was working with a somatic therapist. When we would talk about something and it'd be like, okay, let's process it. I just wanted to move into it super quick, to bounce, to shake, to stomp, and just like go at it super fast at high speed. And she was like, no, let's slow down. Like, she was seriously like, whoa, slow down there. Like, slow the movement down, slow way down. And then I could feel these surge of emotions come through. I could feel the way that my body was actually talking to me and what it was saying from internal place. And I really learned a lot about myself in the flight response, particularly, because that's a harder one for me to feel.
Yeah, I think that this is why somatics is so hard for a lot of people because it does take time and space to slow down and really feel. And for me especially too, like I want to get it done.
Yeah,
I want to move through it.
let's just do this.
And it's taken me a long time of using my tools and regulating my system to be able to sit still and slow down and not
Mhm.
have that same pace as I'm going through these processes so that I'm not just repatterning that same timeline, that same sense of urgency
Mhm.
into my emotional processing.
And it's important to talk about interoception because interoception is our brain's ability to perceive and interpret signals that are coming from inside the body. Our breath, our heartbeat, our hunger, temperature, and emotion. So it's the foundation for presence and for self-regulation.
But when we have trauma experiences in our past, that can distort our interoception. So when the internal sensations have become paired with danger or threat response, like panic or shame, or maybe self abandonment and dissociation, the brain really learns don't feel that. That's not safe. So even subtle sensations like the tightness in our chest or the heaviness in our gut can activate a flight response.
We often talk about flight as running from danger out there, but for many of us, we're fleeing from what's in here. We're fleeing ourselves. And signs of an inward directed flight response look like can't sitting still without distraction, constantly planning, constantly problem solving, overtraining, hyperfitness.
Mhm.
Sound
Mhm.
familiar? Needing noise or stimulation always in the background. That emotional avoidance marked as productivity.
Yeah, it's really survival through motion. The body learns stillness is feeling, feeling is a threat, so don't ever stop. And I think a lot of people can recognize this. Like if you've been in a session with your therapist or in a Zoom and you get on there and you're starting to work into feeling those feelings and you just get that strong sensation of, I want to run away. Sometimes the fist will even ball up. It takes everything you have to stay in the room, to stay present. Maybe you dissociate and check out and also, too, sometimes you'll just tell the person what they want to hear, right? Feeling the emotions is scary or unknown. So you're just going through the motions to get out of it as soon as possible. And that's why it's so important that we start to do this in minimum effective dose so that we're not just repatterning that stress response.
Yeah.
And then the reasons that we have this fear of our internal sensations is often rooted in our early or developmental trauma where our body signals were ignored or punished or unsafe to feel. It was just too much. And we didn't have the space to regulate or anyone to attune or co regulate with us.
Yeah, I think about the child being punished for crying, or teens who are forced to override exhaustion or hunger cues, or someone who grew up in chaos and learned to ignore the body cues to survive. So the brain disconnects from the body as a protective act, but that protection becomes a barrier to healing later. And as an example, we're looking later on at life as a high functioning adult who can't recognize their hunger cues, cues of fatigue or emotional overwhelm until their body starts to break down. There's a mask of productivity when flight looks like success.
Yeah, high performers are often praised for flight based coping skills, but beneath that productivity, there's often anxiety or emotional suppression or shame around resting or doing nothing. And a real disconnection from core needs, like you were talking about, Jen, that inability to even feel like, do I need to go to the bathroom? Am I hungry? Like, am I in touch with what my body needs, even at those most basic levels?
And I think what often looks like discipline is dissociation. We work with a lot of women with a high flight response, a high
Mhm.
flight drive, who are very successful, but they are working 14-hour days, not because they're inspired, but because it's not safe to rest, and they're more trained to the internal chaos and staying constantly in motion.
The problem with that, because this can be praised, right, and by our society for having these skills of really overperforming, overachieving, but eventually that does start to break our system down, right? When we have this disconnection from our interoception, it leads us into pushing past our real physical needs and depleting our resources and ending up in a state of burnout. We are living in this state of chronic stress, so we have constant cortisol in our system that really wreaks havoc on our hormonal regulation. That can start to lead to digestive issues. And again, it can lead to emotional reactivity or emotional shutdown. There's a lot of difficulties with boundaries or having a relationship with ourself. And over time, this can compound into some pretty big physical health outputs as well as mental health. Because when you can't feel your body, you can't really accurately assess your capacity or know when you need to stop and rest and repair. And we've done so many episodes on the importance of rest for positive adaptation and recovery.
Yeah, and it makes emotional processing nearly impossible because if you can't feel it, you can't move it. So let's talk about how we can work with our flight response.
I think one of the first steps is to really just reframe it as an action signal. Instead of interpreting that urge to leave as bad, we can ask, what is this trying to tell me? Is there something here that's not aligned? Is my system not resourced enough to handle this right now? Do I need to cultivate a little bit more safety? Do I need to spend some time with my body, use my tools so that I can stay present? The goal needs to be maybe broken down into smaller steps so that I'm not constantly spiraling into this F response, or maybe I'm moving too fast in this process. Is it possible to start to slow down and reassess and reevaluate that timeline so I'm not coming from that constant sense of urgency.
And I think we really need to somatically process the stress, right? We include movement like shaking, working with the vocals and the breath, right? We sit with this idea of minimum effective dose so that we resource ourselves before we go into the emotional processing.
Yeah, and really playing with that idea of minimum effective dose is
Major.
so important to not re-trigger these patterns. And then sandwiching our practices with tools that resource our nervous system. So I'm going to use tools or even just do something like go put my feet in the earth or be out in nature, something that helps my system regulate before emotional processing and then afterwards as well, so that I'm teaching myself I can mobilize through this stress response. I can modulate through this stress response and come back to regulation and safety so that I'm not just moving into it all of the time.
Yeah, and I think working with the feet to really ground them, working with them in a sensory stimulus type of way, working in the proprioceptive system and like literally getting comfortable with your feet being on the ground. And like interoceptive training is really important to emotional processing because we can practice presence without pushing. We can teach our body that it is okay to be here.
As we're moving through this season about emotions, in our episode on the fight response, we explored how anger, while often entangled with chronic fight, is actually distinct, healthy emotion that deserves space and expression. And so today we're going to look a little bit at fear, another core emotion that I think is often misunderstood or maybe minimized or suppressed, especially when it gets fused with that chronic flight response, because fear is not a weakness. It is a primal protective emotion that is designed to help us assess danger and take appropriate action. And I think in our culture, often we are taught to override our fear, like take massive action anyway,
Totally.
push through the fear. You're going to have to push through it to grow. And we're taught to not process through it, but to override it, to numb it out, or maybe even to shame ourselves for having it. And we think of it as irrational. But in truth, fear is an emotion, just like all emotions. It's constructed from those internal bodily signals. It's built on our past experience and the social context that we're in. And so we want to start to unpack the difference between feeling fear and processing it as a healthy, necessary emotion and a chronic flight response, that reflexive state that is hijacking that fear before it can be felt or understood or acted on with clarity. So fear is this natural adaptive emotion. It's not a flaw. It arises from our interoceptive and sensory inputs and is interpreted by our brain. And it really signals to us that something matters, that there may be a risk, or that we need to gather more information to determine safety. It's a call for presence, whereas flight is a reflexive survival response driven by that sympathetic nervous system state. And when we are in that chronic flight response, we start to perhaps bypass our emotional experience, including the experience of fear, in favor of distraction or movement that takes us out of that feeling and that processing.
And that prediction then often shapes our behavior. Instead of feeling fear and responding to it appropriately, we flee the sensation of fear itself. And that can look like avoiding conflict, difficult conversations, constantly shifting our roles, relationships, moving the goal line. And it's staying busy so that we don't have to sit with the discomfort that's living internally. Dismissing fear as irrational instead of listening to its wisdom, right? That avoiding slowing down to feel the body and to communicate with it because the emotions are scary.
That is where I really use the tools, the regulation tools, the neurosomatic tools to create space between the sensation and the action, right? So different practices, maybe EFT tapping or working with my cranial nerves or any of my high payoff tools, working with my vagus nerve for parasympathetic activation, doing tools that help to re-engage my prefrontal cortex so that I can start to differentiate between real versus perceived threat, and I can start to respond with clarity instead of that automatic escape. So like what that looks like for me is I still feel the flight response sometimes, but I have more of a pause around it. And there are times where I still need to step out of a situation, but say I'm like in conflict with my partner, I can say, I need to take a walk, but I am coming back and we'll talk about this. And I can move through it very differently. And I can recognize when I'm going into patterns of overworking or overdoing. And I can pause and think, is there an emotion under here? Is there something that I need to process? Does my system need some help with modulation? And I can repattern that way instead of subconsciously going into the behaviors and never knowing that there's something else going on under there.
Yeah, because the thing is that fear isn't going anywhere and there's a real cost to suppressing it. It doesn't go away, it just goes underground. Suppressing fear results in elevated sympathetic tone and chronic dysregulation. The insula and the amygdala continue signaling threat, but without a conscious label, the fear often expresses itself through anxiety, restlessness, urgency, or somatic symptoms like GI distress or insomnia. Flight becomes the default when the nervous system lacks capacity. If fear wasn't met with co-regulation or repair early on in life, the nervous system wires in avoidance as protection. Motion becomes safety, but without tools to regulate, the system stays stuck in a loop, reinforcing fear over stillness or vulnerability. So when we slow down and we resource the nervous system, we build that emotional tolerance. This opens the door for neuroplasticity as we practice staying present with fear and using it somatically with the neural inputs. We literally change how the brain predicts safety, increasing interoceptive accuracy and decreasing reactivity over time.
So we really want to start to regulate our system, begin to modulate through our activation states so that we can return to safety, so that rest becomes possible because it's really important for positive adaptation, and to start to move away from this idea that we can't feel and process the fear, right? There is wisdom there for us to take in when we have the capacity to process our emotions. We don't always just have to push through it. And we always want to recognize, too, with all of these F responses, our flight response isn't a failure. It's our body's attempt to stay safe. But safety doesn't just exist in motion, right? With regulation, we can retrain our system to recognize that stillness, presence, vulnerability is safe.
And I think it's really important to recognize when we do have fear because it's so natural and our system is really built to look for to feel fear, right? It's a system built on surviving and we can't get rid of the fear. We need to learn how to walk with it, right? Sometimes there's fear around recording this podcast or going into the next evolution of our businesses. And sometimes fear comes in having a difficult conversation, but recognizing it, holding it, and processing it allows for those conversations to happen from a really regulated place. And I had an experience in my body where I was really fighting a frozen shoulder, and it happened for about, it was a total of a 13-month process. And when I did the processing in a peak somatic experience, what I learned, what I released and purged from my peak somatic experience was fear. It was feeling like literally, like you describe it as like a caged animal, fear releasing out of my body. And then when I left ceremony, I had full range of motion practically back in my shoulder. So it gets caught up in our bodies, in our tissues, in our muscles. And so it's just important to honor it and to walk alongside of it. Fear is a friend of ours. And so it's not it's not part of your personality. You're not flaky, you're not avoidant, you're not broken. You've been trained to override fear, to push through it, or to let it totally shut you down, right? And then as far as flight, you are trained from an early age to flee discomfort. And those patterns just continue to shape ourselves, right? But there is a lot of hope in neurosomatic intelligence because we can change. We can work with the body. We can stop running from our emotions and start reclaiming them as tools for growth and for connection.
Yeah, I think it's so wild for people to think that fear, that they want to move beyond fear.
It's
It's just a part of being a human being and the world that we live in.
It's kind
is
of scary.
there are things to be scared of.
For
There are
sure.
big things to be scared of, especially for certain populations, certain people,
For
for
women.
women. Yeah, like there are times when it is there. And so it's not like we have to override it. And like you were talking about too, even if it's things we're really excited about, even if it's doing this podcast or a new level of growth, there is going to be a natural fear response there. And it does need to be processed at a somatic level.
That's why I think it's so important to recognize it, because there are situations where we really need to be able to feel that fear in our bodies, like real-time situations in our society that we need to be able to feel that fear and then react accordingly from it. But if everything is scary and we're avoiding the emotion entirely, then there is going to be very hard to to understand and take action when it's necessary to do that.
We become disconnected from our
Yeah.
intuition
Yeah, exactly.
and driven in this constant pattern of fear and anxiety rather than being able to tap into the real present intuitive
Mhm.
sense.
Mhm. Mhm.
So, if you're ready to take some change here, to start working with your emotions so that you don't have to run from them, working with your body to feel and to process and to stop replaying this pattern, then join us inside rewiretrial.com. You'll learn how to build the capacity to experience emotions like fear without being stuck in a constant looping state of chronic flight.
Yeah, subscribe to the podcast. Share this conversation with someone who's in flight, or maybe you're in flight and you want someone to understand you better. And then we'll see you online at Rewire Trial, and we'll be on the journey with you from a grounded, empowered presence place.